Thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So, as Matt alluded to, we're going to talk about generative AI. We're not going to talk about serverless. I was trying to figure out a way to squeeze this into the serverless theme. Maybe it's programming language less, or I don't know how it could be, but I'm not going to talk about products or technology services, AWS services. I just want to share like my journey into this role for the last 18 months. And I want to talk about, and I want to share some considerations about what I've seen, what we're seeing on a daily basis. So a little bit of background about myself, and I want to use this slide just to set the stage a little bit. It's interesting because I'm starting with the mainframe, and this is the first conference where every single session had a mention of the mainframe. I'm not sure what's going on, but I started at IBM back in '94. I actually never worked on the mainframe, but I was tangentially involved, obviously, into the mainframe being at IBM. I actually started on this thing called the personal computer, right? At that time, the personal computer was, this technology that IBM pretty much invented, and nobody at IBM wanted to really invest in basically. So I started over there, and I transitioned very soon into the server space because at that point we're trying to build servers with x86 Intel chips. So we were working on that space, and one of the things that I wanted to use this slide for is that a lot of the transitions in my career, and I see a lot of young faces here. By the way, I dress like a 20 years old, but I'm very old. So I wanted to show a little bit of my trajectory and some of the wow moments that I had that made me transition from one technology to another. One of the anecdotes that I usually talk about on this slide is that back in 2001, October 2001, and I remember this because it was like right after September 11, I was in Seattle to work with a team that built this gigantic server, right? 16 CPUs. At that time, it was like gigantic. And I was talking to the lead engineer, and he was like, we built this server because we're IBM, we know how to build this, but really nobody needs it, right? Because nobody needs a 16 CPU Intel-based server. Everybody wants to use little small server to run Windows on. So we're talking to this little company called VMware, right? They do these hypervisor thing that it's a thin layer that you can install on this big server, and you can carve out what they call virtual machines. And I was looking at the dashboard that he was using, and I was like, you must be kidding. I mean, this thing is never going to work, right? And so he gave me the CD, because at that time we used the CD to install stuff on those servers. He gave me the CD. I flew all the way back home, and I started to play with it in the office. And I thought, oh my, this thing is going to change the world, right? And it did, right? So I started working on servers and then VMs. I moved to VMware at some point in my career. And then I moved into containers, right? So next, obvious abstraction on top of these. And then something interesting happened, right? It wasn't, for me, it wasn't really a wow moment at that point. It was more something that was growing into me that was like, there is something here that is happening, which was pretty big, which was this transition from the data center into the cloud, right? Which is the point where I moved to AWS and I started working for AWS, and I started working on containers, eventually also on Lambda serverless, just to tie back to the team here. I spent a number of years there, and then less than a couple of years ago, I had another wow moment, right? That made me make this transition into this generative AI space. What was this wow moment or aha moment? Was that I was transitioning my web server from WordPress into, canonical S3, CloudFront, and the usual way to host a static website, and that was battling with the need for a Lambda function at edge, a Lambda at edge function that would do something with my domain. We would strip out the www from my domain because of how I set this up. And I thought, I heard about this ChatGPT thing, right, that everybody is talking about. So let me have a try to that. I mean, I'm not sure if you can read this, but basically I prompted, give me a Lambda at edge function that strips out www from my website. And boom, I got like a 95% working Lambda at edge function that was doing exactly that thing, right? Remember that 95% because it's going to be pivotal for the rest of the presentation. It could have been 90% or 95, I don't actually remember, but it was not right in the end. So that is how I got into generative AI. The first slide before we get into the weeds that I use to talk about generative AI and what generative AI is, which usually kind of blows my mind. Every time that I think about these, it kind of, how can this happen, right? So if you think, I mean, you're definitely not going to be able to see this. But if you use a playground for an LLM or a large language model, right? And the playground, think about the playground as like the SSHing into like an LLM where you can start prompting and exercising the LLM. If you prompt A, B, C, D, right, it doesn't mean anything. But if you prompt A, B, C, D, and you click enter, you get E, F, and then an explanation of A is the first letter of the alphabet, B is the second, and so forth, right? At the core, if you peel the onion of all these things that you can do with generative AI, it's just a statistical engine that provides the next obvious word to what you prompted, right? It's fascinating in its own way that you prompt A, B, C, and then you get these sort of things. And by the way, we see a lot of customers right now using products that are based on generative AI that prompt Lambda. Yeah, okay, Lambda what, right? So there is a whole prompt engineering exercise that needs to be done with these tools that we're going to surface a little bit in this talk. The next thing that I think about and I talk about when I try to share my considerations about this space is that generative AI is pretty broad as a technology or as a movement, right? It's so broad that it touches Hollywood and how it's been disrupting Hollywood and these sort of things. But in our realm, in our space where we are all builders, so to speak, and we use generative AI as part of our application, there are tools and technologies popping up every day, and it's very difficult to kind of, at least it was for me to kind of understand and connecting the dots of where all these technology applies in the stack that we use on a daily basis or that we're building on a daily basis. So I try to make an effort to to classify all of these technologies, right? And the way that I describe what it is going on in this space is starting from what we do every day, right? So we build an application that the user is going to use, right? Which is what I'm representing here, right? The big box is the application. It's basically a bunch of functions, a bunch of code. There is a developer or a builder, and there is a user that is using this application. For the user, I'm using like a little bit of an extreme example here, like a user that is using like a SQL query to get data from a system or something like that. This is a little bit of an extreme example, but it try to serve the purpose of this presentation. So as I said, there is a builder, there is an application code, and there is this user that is actually consuming the application. Generative AI plays in these three different spaces and in these three different roles. So the most canonical use case for generative AI is what I refer to as generative AI at consumption time, where you as a builder can build part of the application that surface with generative AI. Maybe you're going to use Bedrock, for example, to create functionalities inside your application that expose a natural language interface to the end user, right? So the end user no longer needs to write a SQL script to get the data, but he can use natural language to extract the same amount of data or the same type of data. Like, give me all the users that live in Cardiff and are more than 50 years old, whatever, right? And the system will translate these into that. The second canonical example of how you can use generative AI is what I refer to as generative AI at development time, right? So this is the use case of the builder, of the developer, that is using generative AI to create the application, right? So at development time, because once the developer has built the application, there is no more natural language involved, whatever, right? So the user is actually using generative AI and the natural language to create the application, but the application will look pretty much the same. The third way, which is, I would say, less common, but it's getting a little bit of traction, is this notion of using English as a programming language, right? So in this case, it's generative AI at runtime, right? So you use English inside your application to be able to do things that you would not be able to do very easily using a programming language. Like, a couple of examples for these. One is a stupid one because I built it. I hate WhatsApp messages, right? So I hate, WhatsApp vocal messages, right? One day I got a 5 minutes and 2 seconds WhatsApp vocal message. I was like, I'm never going to listen to this one, but I had to, right? So what I did is I used step functions, very theme for the day, where I used that file, that vocal file, as an input, right, to the step function workflow. I use Amazon Transcribe to turn the vocal message into literally a wall of text, because 5 minutes is a wall of text, right? That I was not going to read, right? Because it was too long. And then I used Bedrock to say, given this input, just summarize it into the more core point that are interesting in this message, right? So this was not surfaced to the user, whatever. It was like a way to build this thing. One of the other example that I found very interesting, it's a blog that is linked into this slide. So when you get the slide, you can click on that blog and read more in details. There is a use case that this developer was trying to attack, which was comparing addresses, right? Comparing physical addresses, right? Most of the time in documents, you get physical addresses that are written with a different format. Now, you as a human being, if you read like these two different physical addresses, even if they are not written in with the same format, you can kind of guess, right? So yes, this is the same place, right? Because you understand how to read those and you get the sense that they are the same place. Trying to create a mathematical formula to do this is very difficult, right? So how can you implement a mathematical formula in a programming language that is able to do these sort of things? It turns out that LLMs are great at doing these things, right? You can give, and this is the example that has been talked about in the blog post. You give that application, that function, two very different physical addresses with different formats, and the system, the function will be able to tell you, yeah, this is the same address, or no, this is not the same address, right? Very interesting way to use generative AI inside the application. So English as a new programming language, so to speak. Because my experience is very much around generative AI coding assistant, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that use case, right? So basically, that is the use case of generative AI at development time, and I want to share some consideration about what I've seen users doing and things like that. By show of hands, how many of you here are using generative AI assistants for coding? Amazon Q, Copilot. Okay, bunch of you are already half. Good, good. So one of the things that I usually talk about is where are these assistants going, right? So what is the trajectory of these assistants? And remember that these assistants, I mean, 2 years ago did not even exist, right? Roughly 2 years ago. So we have seen in the last couple of years already a trajectory of functionality that they provide that are very interesting. So these usually started, all of them usually started with this notion of inline coding, right? So basically, you're in your editor, you're writing your application, and based on what you're writing, do you remember the first slide that I showed? A, B, C, and it just goes D, E, right? That is kind of the same thing applied to coding. So you start typing a function name, and it will start populating what the assistant thing you want to build, right? Inside the editor. Soon after, we moved into this notion of the chat, right? That was kind of a very common way to do things because, of course, ChatGPT was all the rage and is still all the rage. And basically, developers were expecting this way of communicating with the LLM more in a chat format, right? So a lot of these tools implement this chat interface where you can start asking things like, how do I query a DynamoDB table, for example, right? And do things like that where you get like examples of code or an explanation of how you can use this piece of code to do certain things. The frontier right now is this notion of these agentic frameworks. And I don't know, lots of people hate the word agentic, but that is how they basically behave. So instead of you having the control of the coding part, whether it's inline coding or these chat interfaces, there is this notion of agents. And inside, for example, Amazon Q, we have this notion of the agent for software development, where you basically ask Amazon Q in this case to be able to create a feature out of the box, right? Or a feature, it could be like a web interface, like what I'm doing here, right? So I'm not going to read it all, but basically you can prompt it to do create a new Flask route in a dedicated web page at the following path, and you explain, what that page needs to do. Essentially, you want the assistant to build on your behalf like a user interface for a particular application. So this is kind of, like a very quick run through of what we have seen in the last few years in terms of the evolution of these interfaces. One of the other things that I don't have in this slide deck that is very interesting in my opinion, and we're talking about with some of you outside, is this notion of the fact that we as an industry, I'm not talking about AWS or in general, I mean, we as an industry with generative AI, we spend a disproportional amount of time to talk about this notion of English to code, which is everything that I've been talking about so far, right? So how do I use an English prompt like this to build code, to create code? We don't talk enough about the opposite, which is probably even more useful for a lot of customers, which is using code, I mean, using code as an input to create English as an output, right? Or code to English, where you could use these tools, and they are awesome at these, but you can use these tools to explain a piece of code or to document code, right? A lot of customers are dealing with this problem of there are applications that are in production, and who wrote them either left the company or whatever, and they do not know how to maintain those applications. So having this assistant to create documentation on their behalf is an absolutely big use case that we need to talk more about, and we will. The other thing that is very interesting when we talk to customers is this notion of, oh, how do I measure productivity, right, using these tools? Now, we could go down the serious route here and talk about metrics and surveys and all these sort of things, but we don't have time to get deep into these, which are the most serious part. So what I thought was that I will share like the funny part of this dimension, which is kind of people are starting to talk about, oh, many people want to use these tools to go home earlier, right? And I saw this tweet from Astasia a few months ago that is talking about basically this thing, right? So he was saying, I'm meeting with a lot of customers that are telling me that, what their developers are willing to do is to use this tool to go home earlier. And I thought, I mean, this must be like a Silicon Valley thing. I mean, it must be like a niche sentiment out there. And then I was talking to an AWS colleague back a few weeks ago around the same time, and he said exactly the same thing. He was meeting with a customer, and they were like, how do we measure productivity of this thing? Because most of the people just want to leave at 2 p.m. instead of taking more work to do. So this is the funny aspect of the, how do I measure productivity? But it's a real pinpoint for a lot of customers that are like, should I spend money for this assistant? What do I get back off of this assistant when I start using them inside my organization? The other thing that is very, very hot topic when we talk about these generative AI assistants is, can you trust this assistant? Right? All the whole discussion about hallucinations, right? So how can you trust these assistants? And it's funny because one of the very common, one of the very common, you know, comment that we hear is, how can you trust a generative AI assistant? How can you make sure it's not hallucinating, right? You need to verify every answer and every artifact. And this kind of threw me back like 20 years when I was working on VMs and VMware kind of thing, because these were exactly the same discussion that we were having when we introduced virtual machines on top of that big server with that thin layer. They were exactly the same discussions. How can you make sure that the bug is not due to the hypervisor and it's part of the application code? If I'm an ISV, I'm not going to support a VM because of this reason. Now, of course, very different problems, right? I'm not trying to say these are the same problems, but the point that I'm trying to make is that at every point when there is a new technology, there is always going to be like a trade-off between the value that you're getting and the risk that you're assuming by using that technology. And VMware was not very different from that perspective. So it's basically how you manage the risk, right? So do you trust everything and everyone? Can you trust consultants? Can you trust solutions architect? The other anecdote that I usually share is that the very first hallucination that I've seen myself, well, actually, the very first hallucination that I've seen was me in front of that lead engineer of the big server saying, "You must be kidding. I mean, this thing is never going to work," right? That was like a big hallucination. But the second one is I was working with a customer a few years later, big server, VMware. We were doing some maintenance, and there was a yellow bag bang uh, on that server that was alarming the user for like a fan that was broken or whatever. And the guy that I was working with, the customer that I was working with, asked me, how do I clean that log? Because it kind of disturbing me to see that thing. I don't need to see it. And there were two buttons on that server. One was for clearing the log, and the other one was for rebooting the server. Right? And the hallucination was like, I think that it's the one on the right, but let me check. He didn't wait, and he put the one on he pushed the one on the right, and 2 minutes later, someone knocked on the door saying, "Is there anything going on in production?" So yeah, I know what happened, right? But joking aside, I mean, this is kind of the theme of this slide, right? It at the end of the day, it's a risk mitigation thing, right? I'll talk more about these in one of the next slides, but it's how you use these tools and the risk that you're going to take by using these tools that is going to protect you. The final thought on this theme is that if everything fails all the time, why shouldn't generative AI fail, right? So I think that we're a little bit too obsessed about this notion of, oh, it got it wrong, whereas we could actually extract value um, from these tools. I do think, and completely related to this one, that what we have seen is that I think that there is a problem of mindset, right? I'm not sure if it's a problem, but it's definitely a consideration of different mindsets, right? So typically we have, for the very same tool, for the very same scenarios, we have two approaches, right? And the first one is, oh, this is not entirely correct. When we talk to customers and other people, is the one of the reaction could be, oh, this is not correct, right? It's an hallucination. There are other people that take these in a different perspective, right? And they tend to ask themselves, did this thing, help me save time for the job that I had to do, right? And I think that this one is the best kind of approach that you can have. A good example of this, I'm not sure how familiar you are, but there is this public benchmark called the SWE benchmark. I think that it's one of the few, if not the only benchmark that is able to kind of spit a number in terms of how efficient these generative AI assistants are. And the way that this benchmark works is that it leverages those workflows that I showed you at the beginning, like the agent for software development, where you prompt an issue, right? You prompt a problem that you have, and you let the assistant solve that problem. So the way that this benchmark works is that it takes as an input like thousands of GitHub issues of existing Python projects, right, on GitHub. And basically, it measures how many of those issues the assistant is able to close, right, to success, of course, right? You're not going to see this number because it's too um, um, little, but in the full version of the benchmark, the best assistant out there can close 21% of the issues, right? So think about that. You submit 1,000 issues, 1,000 requests, and you get a 21% success rate. And you see two reactions to this one, depending on your mindset. The first reaction is, ah, it's wrong 80% of the times, right? So how can you use this thing, right? The second reaction is, oh, 20%. I can take all Fridays off from here to retirement, knowing that these tools are going to get better over time. So maybe I can take Thursday as well. But you see, I mean, the different approach or the different mindset that people use to approach these tools, right? The other question that we hear often over and over is, are these assistants going to replace us, right? Or are these going to replace developers? And I really like this way of putting things where someone was saying, I want AI to do the laundry for me to be able to do art and not the other way around, right? So I think that this gets a lot into the mentality that we need, I think, to start, moving to, which is this is basically a tool that you can use to do the job that you need to do, right? So one way to look at this is it just another layer of abstraction, right? So if I think about this from infrastructure as code perspective, right? Uh, if you see the infrastructure as code progression over time in terms of abstraction, uh, 5 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, you would write like literally thousands of lines of CloudFormation to do something, right? To deploy your your solution stack, right? With CDK, you basically do the very same thing, having to write what 100 lines of code or whatever, right? It will speed that amount of CloudFormation, but what you do is that you focus more on the higher level abstraction to define your workload. What if this is just another layer of abstraction where instead of writing 100 lines of code in CDK, you just write in English, right? Give me like the CDK code to deploy XYZ. And it will produce the CDK code for you, which in turn will produce the CloudFormation code for you, right? So you see where I'm going, right? So different level of abstractions, but this doesn't mean that, CDK has replaced the developer, which doesn't mean that, these tools are going to replace developers either, right? So very important to think about that in that way. So going back to the discussion that we were having in terms of the how do you mitigate the risk, right? I try to think about, what is the framework of adoption for this generative AI assistant? How should customers think about extracting value from these assistants, but also mitigating the risk of hallucination and the assistant getting these things wrong, right? So I came up with this, and I apologize. I mean, my friends make joke of me because it looks like my slides are built with Microsoft Paint 1.0, which is probably close to reality. I apologize for the format, but hopefully the content is inspirational. The way that I think about this is with two lines, right? One is you, and one is the generative AI assistant, right? Because at the end of the day, it's almost like, pair programming with someone using this generative AI assistant, right? And on this spectrum, the developer on the bottom, right? There is the level of knowledge, low level of knowledge on this side, high level of knowledge on the other side. And for any task that you're taking on, you will sit somewhere on this spectrum, right? It's important to understand that this is not who you are, but what you're doing. You could you could have invented Java, so you would be here on the spectrum of level of knowledge for Java if you were doing Java stuff. But maybe you are experimenting with Rust and you know nothing about Rust, right? So you would be on the other side of this spectrum, right? So basically, deadlines divide, when you are in control versus when you are not in control. When you are in control means that everything that the assistant is going to tell you, I mean, you know whether it's right or wrong, right? Being out of control means that you don't know exactly if it's right or wrong. Of course, the farther right you go, the highest it is the return, right? Because you want to extract a lot of knowledge from the assistant when you ask something like build me an application from scratch, super high return, right? Low return is on the left side where you get little return from very simple things that the generative AI assistant can do for you. So with this said, I mean, you can land on many of these point on the spectrum of the generative AI assistant, right? So I define this one as the boost zone, right? So you're still in control, right? But you're asking the assistant to do things that are kind of not complicated, but they're tedious to do, right? It could take you a couple of hours to do a bunch of things that you would do easily, but you would need to invest a couple of hours into that. And you could spend maybe 30 seconds asking the generative AI assistant to do that on your behalf. There is another point that I call the learning zone, right? So you're getting out of control, but not, to the point where you're not understanding exactly what it is doing. You're learning, right? Because you're outside of your control zone, you're outside of your level of knowledge. So maybe you need to invest a little bit to verify what it is telling you, but the value that you're extracting from those suggestions is better than starting a Google search from scratch, for example, right? And then there are the other two extremes, which is the danger zone, farther down, and the limited value zone, where asking the assistant to do something is going to make you spend more time than doing it yourself, basically, right? And this is where you want to gravitate in the end, right? You want to gravitate around this boost zone and learning zone. This is where you want to use this assistant. This is how you mitigate those hallucination, but still you are extracting value from this assistant on your daily job. The last slide that I wanted to leave you is this. I found this very, very interesting, this parallel between, I'm not sure how many of you have heard Steve Jobs mentioning this bicycle for the mind. Who have heard Steve Jobs talking about the bicycle for the mind? Just a couple of people. So I heard this like a few months ago myself. I didn't know about this, but basically Steve Jobs was talking about in an interview about an article that he read many, many years prior, right? Where someone was making was doing a study of what is the most efficient animal on Earth, right? To move from point A to point B, right? It turned out that the most efficient animal on Earth or in the sky for moving from point A to point B was the condor, right? The bird, I think. And the human being was very low on that list, right? Like mid list. We're not, as animals, we're not very efficient to walk to point A to point B. But he also said that someone also reran the study with a tweak, and that tweak was like, what if the man had the bicycle? What if the human being had the bicycle to move from point A to point B? And it turned out that the man with the bicycle blew away the condor. Way more efficient than the condor to move from point A to point B. And he was talking about this in the context of the computer being the bicycle for the mind, right? Which makes a lot of sense, right? Because there isn't a bunch of stuff that the computer can do that you cannot do. It's just easier to do things with the computer. And in my head, I mean, a generative AI assistant for coding is like a bicycle for the developer, right? It's not going to replace the developer, but it's a tool that makes the developer a lot more efficient in doing the job that the developer needs to do on a daily basis. Thank you.